And so I think it's time to begin, and I want to welcome the folks who are here. Welcome to you both on YouTube and also in the Zoom room. My name is Stephen Fetter, and I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office, which is why you have ended up seeing me a whole lot more frequently in the last month than you probably ever have before. It's a delight and an opportunity to connect us all from one coast to the next, and to be the United Church of Canada together in this remarkable way using this technology. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for being a part of these webinars week after week after week as new information becomes available. We're working really hard to try to bring you the most up-to-date information we can, and we are honored by your presence and really delighted with the kind of feedback we've been getting. So pleased that it's been helpful. So I'm going to turn things over to Eric and invite him to begin. Eric, it's great to have you here.
Great. Well, good to be here. And tonight I thought we should maybe start with just even a brief moment of silence in recognition of what's happened in Nova Scotia and the so many lives impacted, all of our lives impacted actually, when we contemplate the horror of what happened there. So let's just take a couple of seconds to reflect on that and honor those folks, and then we'll get into the business of accounting and finance for churches again. Oh, okay. A sad week for sure, let alone the other scary things that are going on with the COVID-19. So I was a bit startled when I put number 5 here up on the slide. Steve is put up that creed. That's great. Joining me again tonight is church bookkeeper and finance expert extraordinaire Clyde Harris, and Beth Symes, who is again a noted legal counsel if you ever Google her, but also serving on the finance advisory committee of the National Church, and an expert in labor matters. So great that they could both join us here tonight. Regular viewers, in fact, anyone who's watched me on a webinar knows I always start with the creed and the words around being called to be the church. One thing for sure, I'm saying we are not alone a lot these days. No matter what circumstance, people are writing in saying this happened or that happened, and literally every day I get to say we're not alone, and we're fortunate to have faithful expertise across the country to share best ideas and so on. So it's been quite a number of days. If we move to the next slide. There we go. It's a standard thing. First of all, I am a little shout out to Vancouver. This is my Canucks jersey. Last week it was the folks in Newfoundland and Labrador, and we'll try to work our way across the country honoring the different parts of the country here, despite those of you who just want me to wear Hawaiian shirts. I start with mea culpas because there's some information that I told you 2 weeks ago that isn't true anymore. And, I feel badly about that, but it's a little bit the way it is. So tonight we're going to cover basically the final game plan for the 10% subsidy processing. The 75% program is going to launch next week. So we have, hot off the press information literally yesterday. The CEBA loan, which was a real disappointment, I forget if it was 1 week or 2 weeks ago, is back in play, and I'll be talking about that in a few minutes. And we'll also talk about more mundane things, like if you are processing a layoff, the triplicate paper form is no longer available. So I want to stress through all of this that we put up the cautionary notes and so on, but literally, if you watch last week's webinar instead of this week's, you're going to be a bit out of date. There are things that change that fast, and it is what it is. So next slide, please, Stephen. So on the mea culpas, the CEBA loan eligibility, it's back on the table. I'm going to put a few caveats on that, but I have strong, repeated, and numerous assurances from government sources that are supposed to know this. And in fact, I have blanket instruction to say people should be applying. I do want to see it in writing, but that's big news potentially. And over the next week or two, I'll offer some advice on that later on in the show. Notice I called it a show. We had some questions last week about what could be included or excluded in revenue. And I've consulted a number of experts. Clyde was one of them, but there's folks across the country. Andy Spears, a fellow on our audit committee, was very helpful, as well as was another audit committee member, Steve Houston, and a variety of other professionals across the country have weighed in. And I'm trying to summarize their best advice on that. But there are some changes again from last week. We certainly had a flurry of activity getting folks signed up for ADP authorizations, and I'll give you a status report on that. Signing up for My Business Account can be a challenge, but the Charities Directorate reopened this week, and I would say it's more of a challenge if you aren't already registered. The messiest problems are ones where you actually are registered, but the name that the CRA has is not you, and they can't tell you who it is. And that becomes very annoying. So next slide, please. Okay, so again, unprecedented. I wasn't around for whatever deficit funding and financing there might have been during the world wars, but you're hearing the numbers announced every day. Today was students, yesterday was community ministries and those serving the frontline workers and so on. There are announcements every day, and I expect that's going to continue for a while. Next slide. So on the 10% subsidy, again, remember that all churches are eligible for this. It's up to it's 10%. It's for a 12-week period and up to 25,000. Over 900 pastoral charges have signed up to have this done for them on an automatically with just the check showing up in your bank account for the subsidy amount off each payroll. There are tools available online for those who need to do it themselves or may have already been doing it. And the processing against payrolls begins April 27th. And rebates, I think a couple of weeks ago, we were saying it took 2 days. Again, the volumes across every system, every company that's involved in payroll or anything, the government offices, obviously, they're deluge. So the rebates will be credited to your bank account 3 to 5 days after your payroll has run. If you're doing it manually, it depends how you submit it. If you're submitting it by snail mail, for example, all bets are off. I have no idea how long that might take. Okay, next slide. One more on the 10% subsidy. So I think we asked this. There are folks who signed up to have ADP do these kinds of things and to improve backup on payroll processing. But if you're one of those people that are payroll experts and we're already claiming this, just let us know. Send us an email, send me an email, or send one to payroll@united-church.ca, and we'll make sure there isn't a double processing. And frankly, even if there is, there's going to be all kinds of reconciling of this kind of stuff. The government is very committed to getting money out there fast, and we'll count and double check and do those kinds of things down the road. Something that came up a lot in the chat box the last couple of weeks was the case where some employees are on payroll and others aren't. And when I say employees, I mean individuals for whom you take source deductions. So there we've said, do the ADP payroll as described, and or use the ADP calculator spreadsheet and do the offset yourself. And we will have the calculator, I think it might be there already, but we have the calculator and the amendment form that you need to complete. It's available on the ADP system, but it's also going to be available on the national website. And through all of this, I want to stress that if you haven't done it by now, this isn't the most mission critical thing. If you can get by the next few weeks, you've got several months to do this. You can claim this later on, or just claim the 75% if you're eligible for it. You should, the folks that I assume were rushing to have this done for them either really wanted the payment fast or really wanted it done for them. So when I say here, you can wait if your cash flow allows, I think we have until October 20th or such date. You've got a fair bit of time to let all the fuss subside. Next slide.
Just before you leave that topic, Eric, somebody's asking in the chat here, this 10% rebate, if we have ADP do it, they'll backdate that for the March one and the April one as well. It's not that it only starts on the 27th of April. Is that correct?
That's right. That's just when the first rebate will be. They will calculate you up to the maximum allowable rebate for the period. So yeah, yes, they will catch that up.
Thank you. And James is adding that you're going to do the 75%. You have to do the 10. They're assuming you'll do the 10% as well. Is that correct?
The 10% applies to everybody. And when I say everybody, I think there's a payroll max of $1.5 million, which is no congregation, I don't believe. So yeah, the 10% applies to everybody. The 75% you have to qualify for. So the reason we've exhorted everyone to claim the 10% is that's certain, and you wanted to get the money soon. You will have to offset that 10% against your 75% claim if you're eligible. So it's like in your individual tax, if I paid installments and you didn't, and otherwise we're the same, we'd have a different tax result at the end of the year.
Thank you. And so there's another important question from Jim on the chat here. Eligibility for that 75% program depends on proving an income drop. So is that 10% considered income? If we get the money back, the 10% rebate?
Yeah, no, that's fair. It isn't actually, but it is income, and it is government grant income when the time comes to report it.
Yes, but it's not. It doesn't offset the 75%, the 30% eligibility for the 75% program.
That's correct. And again, these numbers have changed a little bit. You now need to meet a 15% test in March and 30% for April and May.
Thank you. The other questions I'm seeing have to do with the 75% program, so I'm going to get out of your way and let you keep going.
Sure. Okay, so the 75% program is where we had the most news this week. And let's go to the next slide. So this is a recap of the numbers. And basically, you could pay 75% of an entire salary up to that 58,700 number. But again, the key number, that the maximum subsidy is $847 a week. And if somebody makes more than 58,700, then the weekly subsidy amount is $847. And if they make less, it's prorated down based on whatever the number is. There's been some interest around what people are paid. Again, the Prime Minister has been exhorting us throughout this process that with a 75% subsidy, they're saying, please try to pay people up to 100%. But it's not mandatory. And as Beth pointed out last week, federal law takes a certain position, but it doesn't override provincial employment standards. So there's all kinds of complexity there. We're certainly thinking that a 75% subsidy might be enough to avoid layoffs in the short term. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we still haven't seen what the application form looks like, Clyde, unless that changed today, but the online calculator was launched yesterday. And it's an Excel spreadsheet, and the whole idea is that you input your payroll. A key complexity, if you will, is that it hooks off either weekly or bi-weekly pay. And that isn't how, there are some folks who pay that way, but most of us don't. Most of us use a monthly salary structure, even if we happen to issue paychecks twice a month. So there is a need to convert the numbers to use the spreadsheet properly. And the spreadsheet itself is available at this web link. And I don't believe you submit the spreadsheet itself. It's supposed to be a tool for you to calculate what your numbers will be, and then you'll input those into the online application that we have yet to see. Clyde, you've been playing with that spreadsheet a little bit. Is there anything? I'm probably oversimplified.
Well, there's a couple of things here in the monthly wage or the semi-monthly payroll, which is the two things that are mainly done with ADP. We have to make sure that we get right into down to weekly. And remember that 2 weeks does not equal half a month, or 4 weeks does not equal monthly. So you got to make sure you calculate it properly. When you're inputting the payroll amounts, there's two different boxes you can use, either bulk entry or each employee separate on a line. Do not use both of them, because if you do, it doubles up the amounts totally. So use one or the other. I found that because most of us have very few employees, it's easier to use the one that is just where you put the employee in, and it works it through. It gives you the numbers, and you're quite right, Eric. We do not submit that form. It's not designed for submitting. What you will do, though, is it highlights the main numbers that have to be put into the application form that we have as yet to see.
And if I can, folks, I heard this just once so far on the broadcast. I think it was yesterday. But I think I heard them say that applications start on the 27th and that payments would start on the 5th of May. Now, again, believe that when you see it, but so far the CRA in particular has been quite remarkable at getting payments out to people. If you look at the benefit payments, or if you look at well, it's the financial sector that's been pumping out the loans, but literally billions and billions of dollars have gone out fast as a response to this. So again, the application apparently will be online next Monday, I guess that is. And the eligibility calculation, the numbers should be done on that spreadsheet. That's online, that's the government spreadsheet. Clyde? I wasn't
Yeah,
sure if you were.
eligibility calculations are not done there for the
Oh, I'm sorry.
15% loss. You have to do that separately, and there is a bit of complexity to that because you've got to take either a month-to-month comparison year over year, or you can take the average of January, February, and compare that to March.
Yeah.
And
No,
so you've just got to be careful with that one.
right.
If you are a representative, so you've gone into CRA on the My Representative, you will be able to use that to access the application, provided you have a level 3 access. There are 3 levels of access. Level 3 gives you the most access, and that's the one that you need to be able to get in. That was just clarified today.
Okay, thanks, Clyde. And I guess I misspoke. We have talked about the threshold and been encouraging people to calculate that. And I'm going to say a few words about the multi-point pastoral charges again, because again, that's an area where we've picked up some more knowledge. So again, if you happen to have the My Business account, that's great. But if you don't, there's going to be, some kind of online, always online, no paper now, but some kind of form that you can just go into without having My Business account as well. And for this purpose, I've said consider putting all staff on ADP, because the whole 75% calculation, it's not clear to me what records the government will have for some of for some of us who file manually and don't do a consolidated T4 summary. So next slide, please. But this is big news. This is if you already know where you stand, this could be a serious revenue to help tide you over the next little while. So again, applications open on the 27th. My Business account, represent a client, or this separate online application form, which we haven't seen yet. We will be talking about it in detail next week. We can walk through the form. I think what we'll do is probably focus on the online application form, because folks who have the other tools, I think will find that it's a pretty straightforward transaction. The other, this is part of the online descriptions, but it will be processed at the payroll program account level. That's the RP number. So there are some of you out there that have 2 RP numbers, or perhaps even more, but you file a separate application for each RP number. And that is the suffix that is part of your business number. It might, your charitable number is RR, your HST number is RT, and so on. One more slide, and then we probably will stop for a few questions. So yeah, this is some evolving thinking on revenues. There's some revenues. There were a number of questions last week in particular about, say, M&S or any pure flow through where your church is doing a fundraising program, perhaps for a partner agency, another charity. If it's pure flow through, we've come to the conclusion that revenues probably should only be counted once, and therefore it would make sense at the local level not to count M&S and not to count monies that you've raised for. It might be an emergency appeal by the broader church. It might be a local agency that you support. The revenues we do want to capture are the revenues over which the congregation has discretion. So again, if it's complete flow through, we think you could exclude that. Bequests, I was wrestling with this. In every church I've ever been in, a bequest is a relatively infrequent thing, but does it meet the test of an extraordinary item, to use the language of accountants? And we thrashed that around. It's certainly infrequent, but it is a normal thing for a church. So we think bequests should count as revenue. again, cash in the door. A standard feature here, not too applicable to our churches, but maybe more to our outreach ministries, is that you can elect to include or exclude government income. So these are just some refinements from what we've talked about in recent weeks. Similarly, if you have an investment fund somewhere, even where there are realized gains, if it's within the fund, you're not receiving that money. You don't have it to use. So we're saying that could and should be properly excluded under the language of on account of capital. And I've mentioned a few others that we exclude. HST rebates aren't revenue in the accounting sense, and restorative care payments are offsets of expenses. They aren't revenue. So those are some elements to take into account as you're calculating your March revenue for 2020 and comparing it either to prior year or the average of the first 2 months.
Just one quick comment here, Eric. This point where you said include or exclude government income, the subsidies you receive are government income, so they can be excluded as long as you're consistent with it.
Right. Well, and in this case, I think there's even language that says you can exclude it anyway, but as opposed to an accessibility grants, for example, or other forms of government revenue.
Right.
Yeah. And again, having said all this, things are changing fast enough that we're trying to give you the most faithful and what we think is right for the church response here. We aren't trying to game the system. We're trying to determine whether we are legitimately eligible for this support. And frankly, you should even have a conversation on whether you need this support. But if we're going to do it, we're going to do it right, I guess is all I'm going to say there. All right, so are there any questions about the 75%? I'm going to move into the multi-point in a second.
I'm not seeing a lot of questions on the 75% yet, but there's one here in the chat. What about mission support? Money that comes from the national church and goes to a congregation, is that considered income or is that non-arm's length revenue? What's
Yeah,
your ruling on that?
We've thrashed that one around a fair bit. We've ultimately concluded that that's probably a non-arm's length transaction to the extent that it's one part of the church basically granting money to the other, and therefore shouldn't be included. That's the current wisdom. And I want to stress through all of this that the United Church in particular is the most unusual of all the various denominations in terms of its legal structures. And that just means that we're often, a square peg in a round hole. Next slide, please. Yeah. So originally, the program is very clear that it was based on payroll number, and it didn't matter, if we had a pastoral charge that basically was more or less a payroll facility, it might not have revenues that go up or down. And one of the items from last week, was relaxing that standard and allowing to look at sort of entities either broken out a bit more or consolidated. And in the case of our pastoral charges, then the conclusion we came to is that it probably makes sense to consolidate your financials. And you do that a little bit for statistics reporting, and you even do that for the government where charitable status is held at the pastoral charge level. So let's just go, what I'm saying there is every multi-point pastoral charge should do a consolidated income statement comparison now, whether it otherwise needs to or not. And let's just go to the next slide for a second. and I hope it's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, so this is something I've used to try to explain other compliance questions. But basically, if the payroll number and the charitable number are at the pastoral charge level, the CRA doesn't even necessarily know if how many churches are under there. It's receiving consolidated reporting. There's the payrolls, reported at that level, and this has implications when we start making pastoral change restructurings and so on. But if you're in this boat, if you're a pastoral charge where the payroll number and the charitable number are up with the pastoral charge, you're already consolidated. Like your normal filings for at least the annual charitable return are already consolidated, and it shouldn't be that big a deal to consolidate something now for a few months to see if you're eligible for the subsidy. Next slide, please. However, this is a pretty common structure too, where each of the underlying points is a charity. So they're filing their charitable number, with the government, and the pastoral charge somewhere in there. Somebody is looking after the payroll. Sometimes it's at the pastoral charge level. That's where it's theoretically supposed to be, but sometimes one of the churches is also handling payroll on behalf of the others. And this is where I'm saying you might not have consolidated your financials. You didn't have to do that for the CRA for your annual return, but it makes sense to do it now, because if you consolidate, we can certainly say that the pastoral charge structure within the United Church is our way of organizing. And therefore, it makes sense to consolidate, even if we're consolidating 2 or 3 or 4 charities. So I'm going to stop there for just a second to see if there's any multi-point folks in the crowd or who have a question. I did see a question about cashing in investments. And yes, if you're actually selling something and generating a gain, if you bought, if you acquired a stock for $20 and sold it for 30, you would need to report that as cash literally in your bank account, and the gain would be income.
Okay, there's a few other questions about what counts as income and what doesn't, and let me just run them off. Somebody's asking, is money transferred from the investment account to the operating account revenue? And I think the answer to that is no. Is that correct?
That's right.
Is
Correct,
all your money.
Transfers of balances are not income, although lots of us tend to think of it that way because we tend to report on a cash basis. So we talk about the bank account was this, and then we moved some money in and we got some donations, but that is not revenue.
Okay, there's another church that has solar panels, and they're getting paid to buy hydro for the electricity that they're generating. Is that income?
That absolutely is income. That's the same as renting a room. They're renting their roof, basically.
Okay, and there's another church that receives money that's designated for food bank or refugee fund or out of the cold programs. Is that revenue?
Well, this is where it gets a little gray. If it's pure pass-through, if the food bank is a separate charity, then that is what we described earlier as that could be excluded, because otherwise it would be double counted. It would also be counted by wherever it's being received. If it's a refugee program, that's a little bit different because it's your own program. When you're sponsoring a refugee, you have said that that's part of your church work. So that one's just a little bit fuzzy. But it does fit. It is at least part of your regular church operations. You're part of your mission.
Great, thanks. And one last question on the 75% program. Sounds like you set up ADP to handle the 10% stuff. but it sounds like we have to do the 75% one ourselves. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. I've actually looked at whether we could try to, produce some kind of extract, but at this point, everyone in the system's overwhelmed, and the government is basically providing a tool for us to use. And as Clyde noted, if there's just a few names on there, it shouldn't be that big a deal. But ADP couldn't apply on your behalf in any case.
Yeah, one of the interesting things with it is on that spreadsheet that they've got, you have to deduct the 10% because they're assuming that everybody has applied for that.
Yeah. Right. And again, that's something that we'll adjust for over time, because the government's actually, for probably the first time ever, moving faster than the citizens are on some of this stuff.
Right.
Okay, so one final question, and it's related, I think, to the slide on the screen. If each church under pastoral charge does their own separate T3010 filing, then what number do you use when you're making this application?
The number is the payroll number, which may, again, I can offer a theoretical answer. Theoretically, it's the number that the pastoral charge has for payroll. But again, sometimes it's, one of the churches will do payroll on behalf of the others. But it's whatever the RP number is. You apply for as many RP numbers, payroll numbers, as you have.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. I'm not seeing any other questions on the topics you've just been addressing. There's one that goes back to these ADP authorizations. Somebody didn't get that request in time. Is it too late now, or can they still squeak under the wire and get ADP to do this for them?
Yeah, I'm going to say it's too late, and my message around let's look at that a little later. Right now, we have to, if we're going to do it from the start of the program, mid-March, we have to have a cutoff point, and we try to allow some lead time there, and I appreciate that that there might be a challenge. So the best we can do there is no, it is too late, but give us another week or so, and if you have any issues with the form or what's required, our payroll experts can help.
Okay, that's all questions I've collected. So Eric, let's carry on.
Okay. So just a carryover around approvals and so on. Wage subsidy applications are a local matter. It's local accounting. It's a local grant. Loan applications, again, I misspoke a few weeks ago now. It's a congregation board approval, or whatever your governance, your body is. There is a region approval required. This would be for any type of loan program. But again, most regions will be setting that up to be expedited in some fashion, because it's all about speed right now. And in the case, the National Church Program, which I'll speak to a little later, has an online application where you don't even have to figure out who to send it to at the region. It automatically will go there if you know what region you're in. But the assumption with all online applications, whether it's the government or with the locally, is that whoever's processing is authorized to bind the applicant. Next slide, please. So here's one where I'm going to choose my words carefully. This 40,000 loan, which is the most attractive thing in the whole program, I'm receiving multiple very senior assurances that despite a technical obstacle in what it says online today about corporate needing to be a corporation, they just forgot that United Churches were unincorporated. Like other churches are incorporated, and I have several assurances that churches are eligible. And I would go so far as to say, if you're in a huge bind right now, take me at my word. I've got some written stuff that, I can say I didn't mislead you. If you can wait a little longer, I'm hoping that even by next week, we might have something in writing. In the meantime, a whole bunch of churches, I think at least, I know of over a dozen. Okay, so a dozen times 40, that's $500,000. People applied on the Thursday when it opened. They had their money, or more correctly, they have a Visa account with $40,000 of spend on it. That's the structure that I've seen in a few cases at least. But those things get processed generally without anyone even looking at it. I think there's one bank that had a system glitch, so they were actually looking at applications, but everybody else is just pumping out the money. And so if you really, really, if you're desperate to make payroll, I've actually got, representatives of government who've said, let us know if any financial institution rejects this. And I said, well, that's very nice, but can't you put it in writing? So that's what we're waiting on. But those of you who have got your balance, I've certainly, what I've written to people individually is wait a few weeks, don't return it just because you think you're not entitled to it. You probably are entitled to it, and that this is a big misunderstanding. So how's that for squishy?
You're at least being clear, Eric, and that sounds like that's the best you can be right now. So thank you for
I
that.
did see some comments in the chat box. I don't know if there's anything, we'll be switching topics again. So if there's anyone with a comment or concern about the emergency business account, again, remember how attractive this is. It has a forgiveness feature of $10,000 of the 40, and it's interest free, and it's basically the most attractive and most immediately accessible thing there is. So those of you who are in a real bind, this is the one you should jump on.
So if
and
you
I'm
get the
looking at,
loan, you have to be able to pay it back. Can we get a loan from the United Church of Canada to pay it back? Or
well, this is where you do have to be able to pay it back. But again, all of this assumes that that you're viable to begin with, and that you've been wiped out by COVID-19. If locally, first of all, if locally you're financially strong enough, then you shouldn't apply for this because it is taxpayer money and all that kind of stuff. If this literally buys you a few more months of existence, it's probably not the right thing to do either, except that, you'd like to at least be all together if we're winding up a congregation. Like right now, here we are on Zoom, right? So bottom line, I hope to have a more formal assurance next week. It's very unusual for any official to say what I just did. But again, the number of assurances and the level of the folks involved is quite remarkable. And there you go.
okay. I'll keep watching for questions on this topic, but right now we're just getting comments and
yeah, no, I saw
discussion
Gord
about-
Waldy, for example, talking about the national incorporated status. That isn't the language in the exclusion. Believe me, we've looked at everything. The real misunderstanding is that most congregations in other denominations are incorporated at the local level, and the folks drafting this thing assume that the existing language would have covered us too, and it technically doesn't. Next slide, please. So United Church loan details will have more on, we'll have the application form up, I think either tomorrow or Friday. And we're updating our language here on at this webpage with the emergency funding arrangements. There's a separate tab for that, but we're trying to have as much of the information in one place. We're trying to link the government stuff changes fast enough that we're really encouraging folks to check there, because by the time we retype it onto a web page, it might change the next day anyway. It's pretty weird that way. So the United Church Loan Program is there. I just saw a question in the chat box around, does the region need to approve the $40,000 loan? Absolutely, for the reasons that Steve just mentioned. There is, if there is an expectation that you'll be able to pay it back, and that you'll want to pay it back with the loan forgiveness feature and no interest accruing, and I think it's a couple of years time that you actually get to do that. So it's a very attractive program as a bailout. Okay, next slide, please. So this, we're into the layoff side of the equation in the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. And I don't know if Beth might weigh in here on this, but it's been liberalized dramatically to include more and more audiences. It's entirely possible that for some of the folks that we call contract, folks that we were paying but we weren't taking source deductions and so on, they could potentially be better off for a 16-week period, because the test is 5,000 of income in 2019. There's been enhancements now to include students this summer. There's been enhancements to allow a degree of income to be retained. And all of this is to encourage employers to not just do mass layoffs as a reaction to this, to see if that can be avoided. And frankly, it's to have money in the economy when so much economic activity has died down. So again, they pumped out literally billions of dollars. I know for a fact that checks are being credited in people's bank accounts within 3 or 4 days of an application. So it's really quite remarkable the way the government systems are working on this, particularly when you consider the whole Phoenix thing that we used to read about. So next slide, please. So again, just flagging the 75% subsidy has to be a material element in any of the layoff considerations. Do check, again, we've stated this repeatedly, whatever the feds say about trying to pay more than 75%, all that stuff, you still have to watch out. Like the legislation is all provincial, and there are all kinds of province-specific inducements and efforts. One that I saw yesterday was, Manitoba is crediting back 20% of workman's comp premiums, that kind of thing. So there's modest amounts in the provinces where you might not even have to do anything, but it is worth checking in with your region and your region website to see if there's something out there that we might not hit our radar nationally. So, and I want to stress that the group benefits plan for for members of the plan, core group benefits would continue during the layoff period. Right now, it's envisioned to be that 16 weeks, and there's also separate provision for folks to make up pension payments in the event they were laid off. So we're trying to do what we can there. Those premiums would be funded by the group benefits reserve, which in itself is something that isn't quite intended for that purpose, but it's all hands on deck. Beth, was there anything you wanted to mention at all in terms of what you've been seeing the last few days or since we last met? There we go.
Go ahead, Beth. I opened your
Okay,
mic.
so a couple of things. First of all, is our suggestion is to pay 100% of wages if you receive a 75% wage subsidy program. Last time I said that if you don't pay the top up and still require the employee to work full-time hours, you're going to run afoul of your provincial minimum wage rules. And that happens if you're paying your staff $18 an hour or less. The minimum wage varies enormously across Canada, from a high of $15 an hour to a low of $11.30. So those numbers, you have to do the calculation to make sure. If you have your employees work 75% hours and to get 75% pay, have them agree to it. Just make sure that you've got an agreement that they are willing to have their terms and conditions of employment changed during the pandemic. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about part-time contract workers. And these are people who earn less than $1,000 a month from your congregation or in general. With the change that was announced last week, these contractors or even part-time employees may well be entitled to the $2,000 that 4 weeks at $500. Plus, if they earn less than $1,000, they get to keep that as well. And so you should be encouraging your contractors to look to see whether or not they can claim the $2,000 and also work part-time. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you for that. I'll share with you one question. I got it a couple of times, so I'm not sure. But I've actually seen folks understand the wage subsidy as being entitled to it only if people don't work. And it's the exact opposite. The whole idea is to keep you on the payroll, and the amount of work is going to depend a little bit on the role. You know, right now, certainly the ministers I know are working very differently, but full-time or more, with trying to hold things together for congregations and keep reaching out. So thank you, Beth. We'll keep moving here. So and this was the dumbest thing I heard today, but it makes perfect sense. You know, if we've just done more layoffs in the layoffs in the country than in its history, and we've done them all in the last few weeks, or 3 or 4 weeks as a country, the paper form that's used by many employers still is literally, they ran out. Now, on one level, that's nuts, and you think, oh, let's reprint them. But I'm told that it's going to take weeks, and I heard the month June mentioned in an email, before they can get this figured out. It is, after all, a 3-part carbon paper form. So if you heard disdain in my voice, all kinds of people, I haven't done it myself, but all kinds of people tell me, and Clyde did at the outset of the show here, it's faster and easier to do it online if you are if you have the information you need at your fingertips. So we have an ADP webinar on how to do this is online at United in Learning. And again, if you are looking at this as an option, then please check each region has templates for their respective provinces. And that is going to be a very important legal thing. I mean, I hope there's broad understanding that these are unique circumstances, but we still want to do everything proper and make sure we're respecting those provincial laws that Beth spoke to. Okay, next slide, please. So we've been saying this for a few weeks, but calculate your revenue decline in March 2020 by all methods. And when I say by all methods, that's comparing March 2020 to March 2019, using the definitions of revenue that we've talked about. Or you can compare March 2020 to the average of January and February 2020. I've done it both ways for the national church, and it doesn't seem to make that much difference in my context, but it might in yours, depending on when you have events, what events got canceled. I know that every Irish stew dinner in the parts of Ontario that I drive through was canceled this year for St. Paddy's Day. So, you know, that's just an example. We've talked about the multi-point charges in the consolidated basis. And we think now that with the Charities Directorate being back, if you have the time to, you might find that it's too annoying to be online, depending on how long the telephone queues are. But it's worth trying to get your business account set up because everything flows way more quickly once that's in place. And let me say, as someone, as a local treasurer who was in a situation where we'd forgotten who our named person was, that is just very challenging to get out of because the CRA won't tell you. And Clyde has answered a number of people on that front, and maybe we'll even do a mini webinar or something on that subject to help people get registered more fully. Next slide. So the United Church has a loan program. I think I've spoken about it for a couple of weeks. It's modeled a little bit on a smaller scale for the government program, in that it's interest-free for a significant period of time. If there's total repayment within that time, there's a repayment feature of $500 out of the 10,000. And again, the expectation that such monies would be repaid. So the application form will be online, certainly no later than next Monday, but I suspect it might be online in the next 2 days. And it is literally going to be an online form that automatically goes to whoever in the region needs to approve it, and that's how it's going to work. I've listed the terms here in terms of interest down the road, but the main item here is that this is intended to help bridge you potentially after these government programs have expired. Next slide, please. So again, it's intended to supplement the federal funding programs and respond as these programs expire. And let me just say that right now, each of these programs has an end date. You know, the wage subsidies are into June, basically. But there's already provision in the regulations to extend them. The regulations, the finance department's given itself room, not saying they'll do it, but I think they have room to go into September if they if they had to. So this program is intended to be sort of a second tier support. There might be cases if we have congregations that aren't eligible for other programs now because of amount thresholds or some other reason. Again, it's a quick conversation with the region. The application form goes directly to the person you need it to get to at the region. And again, a shout out to the United Church Foundation. Their grant and monies that we're borrowing are making all these programs possible. And 10,000 may not sound like a lot, but if 1,000 congregations took advantage of that, that's $10 million. So it adds up pretty fast when you're looking at lots of folks needing to use it. Next slide, please. So what can we expect next week? For sure, we can tell you exactly what the application looks like. I'm assuming it's actually going to be pretty straightforward. So the real challenge will be working with their spreadsheet that's already online. So we'll have the first experience of the wage subsidy. By then we should be hearing about folks already getting their 10% rebate back as processed by ADP. I hope to be using absolute language with regard to loan eligibility, but I've also given you quite a broad. Again, I'm amazed that folks are saying just do it. Folks in authority. So we may need to spend some time on the ROE process if layoffs, particularly if folks are having a challenge with the online service, because that is where you're going to have to go for the time being. So webinar number 6 is going to be on April 29th. You can see that there's a typo there because I'm literally updating this about an hour and a half ago. The usual thing. I don't think that we should anticipate too many new things. I think we're at a stage now where we should rely on this stuff as the support that we're going to get. Obviously the SEBA loan is a bit open-ended there, but I think we better get used to applying for these subsidies if we feel we need them, or if they're essential to our survival at a congregational level. And if anything, it's possible they might get extended beyond June. So I think one more slide, maybe 2, I think. Let's see, contacts, I'm going to guess. Yes. So again, we list the contacts. We have every week we have some new folks doing this. We've also had some folks write in and say, you know what, we're going to be okay. We've had a good response to our PAR campaign, or I'm seeing quite a number of people embracing e-transfers. So if these are just the contact names for various transactions. And then I think I finished with an all in the same boat, but maybe open it up to some more questions as well.
And I need to be honest, I'm not seeing a lot of questions yet, which is lovely. It means that you're being even more clear and exciting than usual, Eric.
Or just run out of gas. One or the other.
Oh, can't be that. One question I've got is about the United Church of Canada loan. If the church is running a deficit budget, are they still eligible?
That might, and I'm going to say that might provoke at least a conversation with the region rep, but we're not going to have rules like that right now. Lots of churches run deficits. The whole idea is to try to get past this, and in particular where there's any sense that all that's needed is some bridge financing.
Okay, thanks. What do you know about the student jobs program? Will we be hiring students to cut our grass this summer?
I don't know whether you'll be able to hire a student to do anything this summer, but certainly there are revenue assurance. The student programs that I didn't pay really close attention when today, but I understand there being an effort to make sure that students have some money to go back to school in the fall. That would be my answer.
Okay. Sorry, what about the recent announcements we've heard about money for charities? Does any of that apply to us?
I don't, except for churches that under their main church umbrella have a very active outreach program or out of the cold program or a warming center, formal programs of that nature that might be significant in their community. I think that the money, it started with places like the Community Foundations of Canada and the United Way and so on. I think that's going to go, if it goes to United Church agencies at all, it would tend to go to the bigger outreach ministries that have significant reach, that serve hundreds or I don't want to say that if you only serve 50 people a day you might not get something, but that isn't going to be a major source of revenue to most of our churches.
Okay, so a couple of questions about the 75% program. First of all, there's churches that are not eligible for March, but they think they would be for April and May, so they can apply for those months. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And let me just make the distinction. I think if you're eligible in March, you don't have to re-qualify for April. You would have to re-qualify to get the third tranche. You would have to re-qualify in May. That's one of the rules they put in to try to streamline it a bit. If you're not eligible in March, but are eligible in April, then you will qualify automatically for May as well.
Okay, and that money that comes in, the 10% or the 75%, is that then considered income that would put our income back up again?
It isn't considered income for the purpose of this. No, it is considered income when you do your statements at the end of the year. It would be considered the same as a government grant. That's what it is.
So the next question then, the CEBA has a requirement. The CEBA is the $40,000 loan program. Has a requirement that a portion of the revenue is from the sale of goods and services. That you think that doesn't apply to us?
Well, no, I think it would apply, but if you had a congregation that had no room rentals or bake sales or event type activities, the idea, when I started talking to the government, they said to me, "What are you talking about? You have room rentals." So it would only the folks that would get excluded would be ones that have no activity where you're charging money to the public.
So even $1 is enough, is what you're saying?
I did not say that. I think where you would need to look is look even at your your last year's charitable return if you were reporting something under fundraising activity, and there's even a line for sale of goods and services. So technically they might want to see something there, but I think frankly that if you have events that generate either fees or you're buying stuff or your dinners, room rentals, all those things would qualify.
Thanks. Beth is wanting to make a comment in here. Beth, go ahead, please.
Sure, thanks. I want to talk about two other announcements that may be relevant. Many congregations rent out part of their space, and their tenants may not be able to pay rent. The government announced its intention to create a rent program. We sort of get a new program a day. This rent program requires new legislation. There are no details to tell you whether or not a congregation would be eligible as a landlord to one of these rent programs, which appear to be a loan, maybe a portion of a grant, but there was no detail whatsoever in the announcement, and it was simply more information to follow. Today, Canada announced its big program for students. Again, this will require separate legislation. So this is an announcement, again, without any details. Students who are currently in school, who are about to start in September, or who graduated in December, will be eligible for $1,250 a month. And if they're disabled or caring for someone, $1,750 a month. And so this might be of real interest to some of the children in your congregation. There's a promise for 76,000 new jobs that will be in agriculture and following up on COVID contacts. And let me just say again, more details to come in the future. And I apologize that I know nothing about either of these, rent or students. These are just being made an announcement sort of each day, and there are no details as to how they will work or whether or not a congregation will qualify. So stay tuned. I should also say that it will be weeks before either of these two latter programs are in fact rolled out.
You're singing out of Eric's songbook now, Beth.
I'm feeling discouraged, actually.
Well, thank you, Beth. And I just want to say, if there were details, Beth would know them. And certainly the rental program is one that needs coordination with the provinces as well.
Right, absolutely.
The student one, I think, just with the parliamentary approvals. Anyway,
I'd like to jump back to a question because I've heard it from a number of people, but I think it was Gordon Waldy put up a question here. I'm trying to find it, where he was asking about booking the subsidies that you receive. What has been recommended is that we book in our full payment to the government and then reduce it for the 10% this is, and then reduce it by the amount that you are getting in the 10% subsidy, but put that in as one of the revenues as an unusual expense. I've actually set up accounts where they're actually referred to as temporary wage subsidy revenue, so that you know that it's there and it won't count as revenue when you're doing some of the other calculations you need. If you're getting it from the through ADP, it comes back to you as a separate entity, so you would want to keep it going that direction. So it's and I suspect the 75% will be much the same way, because that comes back through from the government at some point shortly after you've applied for them.
yeah, if I may, it won't count against this. You know, people always ask, it won't count in increasing an assessment calculation either. This is government income. It's obviously, if anything's extraordinary, it's this. And there's the assurance. And I'm just looking at the some emails here as they come in too. Anyway, there's lots of people debating whether we're incorporated or not. And I'm just sorry, at the congregation level, we're not. And we're happy to have clarification on this point for next week. But on the loans, everyone's telling me we're meant to be included, and if it's really dire, go for it. Anything else, folks? I'm recognizing a few names here, so let me just finish by saying thank you. I always thank treasurers for being treasurers, and I always joke that it's because they're not thanked very often. But But through this time, I hope you're getting thanked, because there's a whole bunch of work that has arisen here that wasn't part of the original deal. So thank you for what you're doing. And hopefully our efforts here either give you at least some comfort, or at least help share the load even the tiniest bit.
Indeed. And sorry, my internet's playing games with me tonight, so I missed the answer to the last question. I'll have to go back and look at it in the recording. But thank you to the three of you for watching all of this information for us, for keeping us up to date, and for gathering with us every Wednesday night. What a privilege it is to have your expertise and your guidance in these unprecedented times. So. It sounds like we're done. So let me invite you to join us again next Wednesday for the next exciting installment of our ongoing serial. Let me invite you, if you're interested, to join us tomorrow afternoon as well. We're gathering with ministers and church leaders, and we'll be gathering with John Young and Catherine McLean, who are theologians and who will help us think theologically about how we respond as church to the situation we find ourselves in, and to the horrible things that happened in Nova Scotia this weekend. So they are working hard at preparing a bang-up presentation, and I would encourage you to come back to these same coordinates tomorrow afternoon at 3:30. In the meantime, I think we'll say goodbye, and thank you, friends, for the work that you've put into your own congregations. What a difference it makes. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week. Bye.
Thanks.